There are people who live their lives surrounded by everything money can buy, but never taste the simple sweetness of love. And there are those who have nothing at all, yet carry the kind of light that can warm even the coldest hearts. This is The Light in His Winter, a story of such two souls, one, a rich old man left behind by his own blood, and the other, a young woman who had lost everything, yet still believed in kindness. Their paths crossed in a place where most lives quietly faded away, and from that meeting, both of their destinies changed forever. St. Agatha's home for the elderly stood on the edge of town, a weathered building with pale yellow walls and long, echoing corridors that smelled faintly of medicine and memories. It was a place where forgotten fathers and abandoned mothers waited out their last days, surrounded by the ticking of clocks and the rustling of wheelchairs. Among its many residents was a man named Richard Hallam, once one of the wealthiest businessmen in the region. He had built factories, sponsored schools, and been known for his pride as much as his fortune. But pride, as he learned too late, could not fill a house once emptied of love. His wife had died nearly a decade earlier, and his two children, Mark and Vanessa, had slowly drifted away, consumed by their own greed and social ambitions. When illness struck and his body began to fail him, they placed him at St. Agatha's under the pretense that he would receive better care. In truth, they were simply waiting for him to die. Richard spent his days staring out the window, counting the days by the number of times the same nurse changed his bed sheets. He hated company, hated sympathy, and hated the sound of cheerful volunteers who came to lift the spirits of the old. He would bark at them, scold them, or pretend to be asleep just to make them go away. And then, one spring morning, a young woman walked into his room, and the silence of his life began to stir. Her name was Amara, a 23-year-old volunteer nurse. She had no family left, no inheritance, no safety net. A car accident 4 years earlier had taken her parents and her younger brother when she was still in high school. Since then, she had lived through foster care, part-time jobs, and loneliness. But despite the hardships, she had not lost her gentleness. Her smile was quiet, not forced. Her voice was soft, carrying the patience of someone who had suffered and chosen compassion anyway. On her first day, she was assigned to room 12, Mr. Hallam's room, with a small warning from the matron, "Do not let him scare you away. He's not cruel, just broken." Amara simply nodded and carried a small vase of white lilies into his room. The man lying in bed looked frail yet proud, his hair silver, his eyes sharp and distant. Though his body was failing, his pride was not. He barely turned to look at her when she placed the flowers on his bedside table. He did not say a word. But she did not mind. She simply adjusted his blanket, opened the curtains, and whispered, "The morning sun is lovely today. You should see how it lights the hills." He did not answer, only turned his head away. But as she walked out, his eyes flickered briefly toward the flowers she had brought. It was the first sign of life that room had seen in months. Days passed, and Amara continued to care for Richard with quiet diligence. She spoke little, but her actions were constant, refilling his water before he asked, reading quietly in his room so he was not alone, and humming softly while organizing his medicine. Richard fought her presence at first. He would refuse meals, push away the water she offered, and complain about the smallest things, that she walked too softly, that she smiled too much, that she made his bed too tight. Yet every time he insulted her, she only smiled and said gently, "You must have been quite a commander in your time, sir." It was a simple sentence, but it carried respect, and something about that sincerity disarmed him. Slowly, without realizing it, he began to speak more. Sometimes he would grumble about the state of the world. Other times, about the betrayal of his own children. And Amara would listen, never judging, never pitying. Her presence began to fill his silence, not with noise, but with peace. One evening, as rain drummed softly against the window, Richard's health took a turn. He awoke trembling with fever, sweat soaking his pillow. The other nurses had gone home for the night, and the matron was asleep in her office. Amara stayed by his side without hesitation. She fetched cool water, wiped his forehead, and whispered softly each time he called out in delirium. He muttered his late wife's name, apologized to her ghost, and cried for forgiveness that no one had ever seen him ask for. Amara stayed awake until dawn, watching over him like a daughter guarding her father. When the morning light crept into the room, Richard opened his eyes weakly and saw her asleep on a chair, her head resting on the side of his bed, her hands still holding his. For the first time in years, he felt something other than bitterness. He felt gratitude. Recovery was slow, but it came. One morning, Amara wheeled him into the garden. The sunlight fell across the roses, and he looked at them as though seeing them anew. He told her about his wife, how she used to love tending to roses, how she used to sing while planting them. His voice trembled when he said her name. That day, Amara didn't speak much. She simply listened. And somehow, that was all he needed. By the end of the week, the old man who once refused to leave his room began asking to be taken to the garden each morning. Other residents noticed too. The man who once shouted at everyone was now seen smiling, even laughing softly when Amara recounted funny stories about her childhood. Months passed. Richard's health improved miraculously, shocking even his doctors. He decided to leave the nursing home and return to his estate, and he insisted that Amara come with him as his personal nurse. The mansion was vast and silent, a graveyard of portraits and echoes. For years, it had felt like a tomb. But Amara brought warmth to its halls. She planted flowers near the windows, filled the kitchen with the smell of homemade soup, and made the house feel alive again. Richard began to laugh, to read, to remember who he had been, not as a wealthy man, but as a husband and father. And for the first time since his wife's death, he prayed. News of his recovery reached his two children, Mark and Vanessa. They arrived in expensive cars, wearing forced smiles. Their visits were not of love, but of curiosity and greed. They saw the young woman who now lived in their father's house and immediately despised her. They whispered behind her back, mocked her humble background, and accused her of manipulating the old man. Amara tried to be polite, but the hatred in their eyes was sharp. They would speak over her at dinner, mock her education, and leave cruel notes meant to break her spirit. But Richard saw it all. And for every insult they threw at her, his heart hardened further toward them. He began to understand who truly loved him and who only loved his wealth. One morning, Richard called Amara into his study. He looked frail but determined. On his desk lay a set of legal papers. He told her that he had arranged to adopt her as his daughter. She was speechless, tears spilling down her cheeks. He said she had been the only one to remind him that he was still human, that he was still capable of being loved. From that day onward, she was no longer his nurse. She was his family. The news shattered his biological children. They stopped visiting altogether, vowing revenge. Years passed. Richard grew older and weaker again, but this time, his heart was at peace. Amara had graduated from university as a registered nurse, funded entirely by him, and now cared for others as she once cared for him. One winter night, as snow fell softly outside his window, Richard called her to his bedside. His eyes were dim but calm. He thanked her for giving him back the meaning of life, and with her hand in his, he quietly passed away. Amara buried him beside his wife, just as he wished, under the roses she had helped him plant. When the will was read, everyone was shocked. Richard had left everything, the mansion, the businesses, the wealth, to Amara. Mark and Vanessa were enraged. They accused her of deceit, called her a thief, and dragged her through court. They bribed lawyers, forged letters claiming she had coerced their father, and even spread lies to the media. But the truth, supported by every staff member who had witnessed their neglect, stood firm. The court upheld the will. Enraged, they plotted darker things. One night, men broke into Amara's home. She narrowly escaped through a back door as neighbors called the police. An investigation revealed the horrifying truth: the attack had been ordered by Mark and Vanessa. Both were arrested, their names forever tarnished. Years later, Amara transformed Richard's mansion into the Hallam Foundation, a refuge for abandoned elders. She filled its rooms with laughter, music, and care, the very things that had saved his soul. Every Sunday, she would visit the garden, kneel by his grave, and whisper, "I hope you see, Father. Your winter truly bloomed into spring." And perhaps, somewhere beyond the veil, Richard Hallam smiled, not as a rich man, not as a forgotten father, but as a soul who had finally learned that the greatest legacy is not what you leave behind, but who you lift along the way. And that is the story of the light in his winter, a story of kindness that melted bitterness, of a girl who became a daughter, and of a man who found love after loss. If you believe in second chances, in love that has no bloodline, and in kindness that changes everything, then remember to like, share, and subscribe to Narratide UG, where stories live, hearts heal, and light never fades.